Hi everyone, here's the Book Chemist once again, and today I'm reviewing The Autumn of the Patriarch, El Otoño del Patriarca, Garcia Marquez's 1975 novel that's hilarious and engrossing, but mostly truly hellish, about a seemingly omnipotent Latin American dictator. This review is sponsored by Skillshare, an online community of creators and experts in a variety of fields, from creative writing to personal improvement, interior design, gardening, and so much more. I'll talk about Skillshare at the end of the video, but you should know that I recommend the website highly, and that there's a link in the description box that will give the first 1,000 people to click on it a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. Autumn is a tour de force in many different ways, but possibly the most striking thing about it is something that will become very apparent if only you browse the book. And it's something that, by the way, I wasn't aware of. I had no idea before I picked up the book, which is, well, the lack of paragraph breaks and the fact that most of the novel is narrated through long, never-ending sentences that stretch for entire pages. The novel is divided into a handful of chapters, each of them following a specific character that was more or less relevant to the life of the Patriarch, but overall it's as if it's narrated within a single breath or a handful of breaths, as if trying to encompass within a single sentence, within a single sentiment even, the seemingly endless, the centuries-long even domain of this Patriarch. I'm really glad that I wasn't aware of this before I started reading the novel, before I picked it up, because it's the kind of thing that could have easily put me off. I, generally speaking, don't really react very well to stream of consciousness narrative and passages. I struggle with them a lot. But this sort of narrative flow, the way the narrative is handled in Patriarch, has very little to do with stream of consciousness, I think. It's not trying to reproduce the thought processes and the thought patterns of a given consciousness. If anything, the Patriarch is very much of a choral novel. The way I understand the prose of Patriarch is that it's an attempt to mirror how the Patriarch's reign and domain in this republic is ubiquitous and covers every aspect of his citizens' life, their personal life, obviously their public life. He is almost as if he's a figure forever, an eye in the sky, forever watching over them, somebody that is always and forever listening to their every conversation and even thought. And just as this figure is so constantly present in the life of this republic, to the point where he almost becomes a part of his citizens, so the story of his domain is told in a similarly uniform manner that doesn't even really allow for paragraph breaks. In a way, the trend of the narrative and the way the narrative flows with this external perspective that very often moves closer or further away from the Patriarch's own perspective, and sometimes shifts to the first person, a first person that sometimes will be the Patriarch's voice, sometimes will be the voice of his enemies, might be the voice of somebody he's interacting with, or of an admirer of his. This voice, the fact that within the space of these huge sentences you get this narrative and focalizing shifts, the feeling I got out of this was a sense that the lives of all these different people, locked sometimes in a mortal struggle with one another, persecuting one another, committing the most atrocious crimes against one another, was still locked so indelibly in place and infused so permanently that their story had to be told within the same sentence or within the same collection of just a handful of sentences. The tragedy of the Patriarch, which is the tragedy of every totalitarian regime, but even beyond that of every dictatorship really, is that these authoritarian figures become so entwined with the cultural life of their nation, with the social life of their nation, with the way their nation thinks about itself, that they become indiscernible from the nation as a whole. And as somebody from a country which was a dictatorship for 20 years in the early 20th century, trust me, we're still coping with the consequences of that. And the process of dealing with that legacy and overcoming it is far from straightforward, because the dictatorship co-opted even every joyous and positive aspect of life in the course of those decades in that part of history. Even the opposition to the dictatorship, somehow, because this authoritarian regime was so ubiquitous, even the opposition to it became almost a part of it and cannot be really taken apart from it. And Patriarch, with this avalanche of a narrative, really captures that uniformity very, very well. The other reason why I'm happy I still read the book and why I still enjoyed this style very much is because it's highly enjoyable, highly entertaining on a very basic level, gives you a lot of the basic rewards of reading, and is not difficult at all. Even though you have to deal with these colossal sentences, Marquez is good enough at using his commas in an efficient manner, at dividing his periods even without reaching a full stop, and overall at making these abnormal, monstrous sentences intelligible and understandable. The only problem with the book is that whenever I was reading it and my fiance was coming to speak to me, I always had to hold her there. And I always looked like a twat, and it looked like I wasn't listening to her, but it's just because I was reaching the next full stop, and that might be 4 pages away. The other element that makes Patriarch so very readable is its humor. Patriarch is a hilarious novel and combines 2 or 3 forms of humor, most notably a kind of popular humor that is very perceivable from the early pages, which is, I guess, the kind of humor that people use, especially people from the lower classes, to deal with the oppressiveness maybe of a political or a system in general, a situation where they have no real avenues for change. It's something that I'm definitely familiar with. It's a kind of humor that leads sometimes to victimization, but it is still a very powerful tool in the hands of people who often lack much else in terms of power. It's very difficult for me to talk about this type of humor and to describe it convincingly in the review, but it reminded me a lot of the kind of conversations I would hear back at the cafe counter in Italy, where people would be like, oh, today is raining again, oh, the thieving government. The other type of humor that's prevalent in the Patriarch and that underlies most of the novel really is, of course, black humor and gallows humor even. This is a novel about the most awful, inhumane atrocities, about infanticide, constant and systematic rape, about murder and torture, and it would be unbearable to read if it wasn't all wrapped in such a convincing type of black humor, if in a way this humor didn't feel so liberating. A little bit as if the laugh, eventually, all of these laughs were never at the expense of the oppressed people, but were always at the expense of the oppressors. Because I guess if Patriarch has one overarching message that you see emerging from all of its subplots, from this type of humor, from every element of novel really, is that for all that this domain, the reign of the Patriarch, was a place of endless pain, maybe nobody on this island was really quite as miserable as the Patriarch himself. In spite of all this power, in spite of his unbound control on every aspect of the life of his citizens, the Patriarch is constantly suffering, is really unable to truly possess any of the things he cares about. He can't ever reach any of his goals, because the nature of his own power changes the relationships he has with everybody else, most notably by having everybody else alter reality back to him. There's this very funny joke toward the end where it's revealed basically that all of the newspapers that the Patriarch reads and the television shows that he watches and the radio shows that he listens to are scripted for him exclusively and have nothing to do with the shows and newspapers that other people enjoy outside of the president's halls. And the tremendous solitude and pain of this is really one of the most luminous elements that you perceive throughout the book. A less refined writer might have had his horrific demonic patriarch meet a very violent death, for instance, or have his people rebel and finally gain a modicum of freedom. Whereas Garcia Marquez refrains from this type of resolution, but prefers to highlight how the nature of the Patriarch's own power dooms him to constant sorrow throughout this entire endlessly sad life. The bubble of the Patriarch's perception of himself, of his idea that his people love him and adore him, is only burst a couple of times in the course of the novel, once by his doppelganger, whom he used to send around the country in his place so that he could stay in the safety of the palace, and once by a prostitute later into the book. And both of these are truly hilarious instances where the Patriarch has to confront the absurdity of his manias and his neuroses, the atrocity of his crimes, and the plain stupidity of it all. It would be easy to see the Patriarch as some kind of dark figure, a dark lord out of a fantasy saga because of his endless power, but he really isn't. What he is at the end is just a sad and rather dumb old man, and even the decisions that his regime and his government take time and again only doom his country further and push it deeper into debt with foreign powers and into poverty and into suffering for everybody. A very valid point that Cesare Segre makes in his introduction to the Mondadori edition of the novel is that Garcia Marquez could have easily turned Patriarch into a novel with a political agenda. Marquez was a very political writer with very strong ideas about the endemic problems of Latin American republics and countries and the noxious influences of foreign powers, especially European North American powers, exploiting and conniving with fascist regimes in Latin America to, well, for their own gain, most notably. And while all of these elements are present in Patriarch and they are part of the life of this fictional Patriarch, the novel never really becomes in propaganda in any way. It simply describes what life is like under a regime of this type, the absurdity and once again the total stupidity of this sort of systems, and allows the reader themselves instead to connect deeply and emotionally with the collective life of this nation. It pulls off a very strange and very difficult but brilliant maneuver, whereby by not being too political, it ends up being extremely political and in a very enlightening and important manner. Patriarch is a very relevant read these days, with the far right on the rise throughout the West, dreaming once more tragically of parliamentary representation in those places where it hasn't gained it already. And these days where many of us are puzzled by the fact that people believing in these authoritarian figures can have such a partial view on reality and can subscribe to these ideas of alternate realities and so on. But Patriarch actually describes this phenomenon very clearly. In fact, all of the fantastical and magical realist elements that abound throughout the novel, it's never quite clear whether these are phenomena that actually happened, or if actually these are just lies told by the Patriarch and by the regime at large that he himself ended up believing in, just as it seems that many of the politicians we see today almost, well, let's say that they almost look like they believe in the lies they tell themselves. Patriarch is on par with The Prague Cemetery by Umberto Eco in being a case study of how hate and paranoia and fear can be bred into a population to sustain the interests of totalitarian and dictatorial regimes. It's not an unproblematic novel, and its treatment of women in particular, women in the novel are constantly commodified, is problematic, although I see how it can be argued that the novel is describing them in the way the regime itself and its agents, so the women peopling this nation. I still wouldn't give it a free pass even with that in mind, but if you have that in mind, if you keep that in mind, and if you can not forgive the novel but have that awareness and still read it to appreciate what it can teach you about the dynamics of power in these sorts of totalitarian situations, then it is a really stimulating and a really wonderful novel, and it is once more truly engrossing, really hilarious until it stops being so. There are a couple of passages where it just, all humor drops and the novel turns just plainly horrific. It is a truly unforgettable book. I highly recommend it, and I look forward to hearing what you thought of The Ottoman of the Patriarch. If you liked it, if you consider it among Marquez's best, what you thought about it. I look forward to discussing the book. Thank you so much, as always, for watching the review. Thank you to my patrons for supporting the YouTube channel, and thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring the review. Skillshare is an online community of creators offering video classes on a variety of topics. These classes are generally divided into rather short videos that you can watch at your own pace. You could watch an entire class in an afternoon, or just take a single section every day for a week or two. And there is a wonderful community feeling on Skillshare. A class I enjoyed recently was given by Kellis, singer-songwriter and also chef apparently, and it was about sauces. I've recently been experimenting with a couple of really delicious sauces that you can use to complement a variety of different meals, so this class really interested me, and that community feeling I mentioned was truly perceivable here too, just as in most of Skillshare's video classes. Once more, the link in the description box will give first 1,000 people to click on it a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership, and even beyond the free trial, Skillshare is really cheap. An annual subscription is less than $10 a month. Thank you once more for watching, and bye everybody.